Hello and welcome to Good Tips for Hard Times, where we find smart people to talk to us about mental health, well-being, and all things gaming. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Anita Sarkeesian. I'm a media critic, public speaker, and the executive director of the Games and Online Harassment Hotline, which is a new emotional support resource for people who make and play games. Hey, remember last week when I asked you all to find one friend? I don't know. Did I say one or two? Maybe three friends? Your choice, 1 to 3 friends, and tell them about the hotline, because you never know who is going to need a little bit of emotional support. And the only way that they're going to get it is if they know these resources exist. So please, after the show, go tell someone. Tell someone you love so that they can get support. How about that? All right. We are going to spend the hour today talking about labor organizing in games. You might remember that we had Sarah Amale on a little while ago to talk about the SAG-AFTRA strike that happened a few years back now at this point, which was a pretty pivotal moment in labor organizing in games. And I wanted to start diving into a little bit more of what's happening right now, because there's quite a bit of exciting stuff going on. So we're going to look at labor organizing in games in general, and also talk about the first successful writer strike in the games industry as well. And joining us to do that is Emma Kinema, who is, oh, that was not supposed to rhyme, but here we go. She can correct me, is a former game developer, one of the founders of Game Workers Unite, and currently serving as a campaign lead for CODE-CWA, the Communications Workers of America's initiative to organize unions in the North American tech, games, and digital industries. We also have Kristen Perez, who is a creative writer and a game developer. She worked with the other writers at Voltage to help form VOW, which is Voltage Organized Workers, to provide solidarity and community with each other, as well as assist each other in negotiations for higher salary and more flexible deadlines. Hello.
Hey,
thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks both of you for joining us. I'm really excited to learn more about this very kind of sticky, contentious, difficult topic that, I get the sense that a lot of people are in favor of, treating employees better and having better labor practices, but don't necessarily know the ins and outs of what that means, right? Like, what does it actually mean to have better conditions for workers? What does it mean to fight for those things and demand more justice in that space? So, thank you for coming on and helping us dive into this. So I want to sort of set the stage a little bit here. Emma, you work at CODE-CWA. What does that mean?
Yeah, and CODE is just a cute acronym for the Campaign to Organize Digital Employees. It's essentially an initiative by the communications workers to organize in tech and games. Right now, we've got a team of organizers and volunteers and members who help assist on the campaign all across the United States and Canada. We run campaigns from everywhere from tiny little tech startups to AAA game studios to multi-million national tech corporations and in between, right? So if you work anywhere even vaguely related to tech and games, chances are we are super down to help you organize. And yeah, it's something that's been going on since early this year. In January, we launched it. And since then, I think one of the things we're most proud of course, is the Voltage Game Workers Strike, which is, we're going to talk about today. But we've also organized unions that have gotten voluntarily recognition, as opposed to having to have a big union election. And, the whole point of the organizing is to ensure that the rights we have as workers are actually enforced, because, just experience really tells us that labor law itself is not good enough to protect people. The bosses, even if they have good intentions, just have a different perspective, to say the least, than workers. And it's us, the workers, who actually make the games, who make the art and content people love. We need to actually have the agency in our lives and in our work to make sure that the work conditions are good and we can make really quality games.
Nice. Yeah. Well, so before we get into the Voltage strike, which I'm super excited to dive into, do you mind just giving us you've been working in labor and games for a little while now, and I think that labor and games and tech is still fairly new. It's like a newer conversation. Can you give us just a brief overview of or correct me, right, that it might not be new, right? Can you give us a brief overview of the milestones or the hit points of what is actually happening in this space and how we got to where we are now?
Sure. Yeah.
You want to take that
And
away, Emma?
yeah, for sure. And I will correct you a little bit in that I think there's been organizing in the tech industry since its very initial inception, even like dating back to like some of the earliest computer science advancements. Like I'm talking like 1940s and 50s. A lot of those people were unionized staff at like public research institutions and stuff. A lot of the early people who were engaged in essentially early modern software programming are actually organized themselves. And even within games, there's actually quite a bit of history of organizing, not always like hard and fast union organizing proper, but there definitely always has been examples of little collective actions and direct actions to improve certain conditions. There's really great examples of like, for instance, the term boss fight came explicitly from someone who was really frustrated. And there's also really good stories of like people slipping Easter eggs into games where, I think it was at Activision early on, they weren't crediting a lot of the work that was going into it. It was completely uncredited work. And so people would like, as Easter eggs, put in their credits and be like, Jim worked on this game and stuff. But you had to like do a bunch of kind of odd steps to find that information, right? So there's always been little forms of like resistance, I think, as long as people have not had a true say and voice over how games are made and their work is done, people always will be pushing back on that. But that has been coalescing over the last few years. I think a brief recap would be, I think obviously the SAG-AFTRA strike, which Sarah is such a wonderful person. I watched that episode and she was really great. Obviously, I think that's like a super important one because that was, I think, part of a turning point that enabled game workers more broadly beyond voice actors to start really wrapping their heads around the fact that, oh, we can actually speak up for ourselves. We can push back and ensure that we have good conditions and decent pay and, all these things. I think there was an initial reaction of people being like, well, these voice actors, they must be so greedy. Why do they get, extra pay for overtime, or why do they have certain royalties and things? And it's like, the question is not why do they get it? The question is, why don't you have it? And how can we go get that, right? And so I think that started a mental shift. I think also worth noting, STJV, a union of game workers in France, also went on a strike, I believe in late 2017 to early 2018. Early 2018, you also saw the founding of Game Workers Unite, which was a large international grassroots kind of movement of different groups across many different continents, working to lay the foundations for early organizing in the industry. And then now, we have a smattering of national unions that are like either spun up or have entered the space to help game workers organize ourselves. In South Korea, in Sweden, in the UK, France, Ireland, the United States, Canada, really kind of all over. There are genuine union organizing efforts now. And so that's kind of where we find ourselves. And I think the real task in front of us is not just doing the education work and the advocacy work of getting people to understand some of the challenges we face in our industry. And obviously your org does a whole lot to help with that as well. But we have to move even further beyond that and actually put agency and power in the hands of the workers themselves to enforce better conditions, to change the things they don't like, and more importantly, protect the things they do like. Because I think one of the main reasons frankly, a lot of the folks I work with are organizing is to protect from like encroaching like corporatization of studios as they continue to get bought up. And, executives want to, strip the quality of games so that way they can just make a slightly higher profit for, putting less investment into the games. These are bad for games and for the workers and for players. And so I really see organizing and unionization as something that's essential to kind of protecting the longevity and future and quality of our medium and our industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about how people might think about unionizing in the mainstream, and it feels a little bit like, if you're not in these communities, it feels a little bit like, well, we had unions in this country like a long time ago that did really important things, right? But that we don't need them anymore, or that it's like a thing of the past. And there's been a lot of concerted effort by like bosses and owners to perpetuate that mythology that like we don't need to unionize. So that history of like that, even that brief history, I think is really useful to us. And thinking about how like union organizing and strikes have been continue to be very prominent in other parts of the world. And it's just kind of, America has a very sort of concerted effort to squash unions to stop us from talking about like labor organizing. And just one last sort of commentary is, I was thinking about how when you talk about like trying to maintain just what already exists in some ways is so reminiscent of and I'm not trying to create a dichotomy, because I think unionizing and labor is a feminist issue, but some of the work that feminism has done of like trying to maintain abortion rights, like we're not even like, we're just trying to hang on to that, right, as opposed to actually demanding more and better. And so, you know, we're in this very precarious political moment. And I think that the labor organizing is such a critical piece of maintaining just even a tiny bit of dignity. So that's my rant. Sorry. Here we go.
No, it's great. I could probably add 3 hours of my own editorialization on top of that.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll do that in a minute. Chrissy, I wanted to come to you and ask, can you start off just talking about like your role in games, maybe a little bit how you got into games and what you do, what you were doing at Voltage?
Sure. Voltage was my start in games. I hopped directly there from fandom. I was writing fan fiction on my own, and I was lucky enough. I still think I was lucky. It still is kind of an honor to be working on the game that I worked on, because Voltage Inc. has been around for a while. That's their Japanese company, and Voltage Entertainment is their American subsidiary. And I was tapped on to write their first lesbian love interest. They write romance games. That's what this is. We write dating sims, otome. And to me, that was so momentous and so important and so cool. And it was my first real writing job. And so I stuck from there, and I kept working for Voltage for about 7 years. That was in 2013 or 2014. And I know that, and I built some really strong bonds there. I'm friends with my producers. I'm friends with the people, you know. I still think of them as my coworkers and friends. And I knew that sometimes the company might be struggling, so it was never a matter of me thinking like, well, I deserve more, you know, I do all this important stuff and I write their top sellers or this and that. It was only really recently that I started talking to some of my newer fellow writers who were talking about pay. And I've always been pro union and pro sharing your wages and all of that. I just never felt comfortable being the one to initiate that. Felt very weird. I had the usual hang-ups. I don't want them to see my pay and be like, oh, you know, screw you. And I didn't know, I knew I wasn't being paid too much, but every time I tried to get a talk or even talk about negotiating a higher wage, I'd get shut down. So I saw that most of the newer writers were earning about 3 cents a word. And we write about 30,000 words a month or more. And I was being paid a little over 4 cents a word after 7 years. And it was like shocking to me at that point that, and I feel embarrassed now talking about this honestly, that it took that to be my cold bucket of water. Like, I felt like I'm showing them that after years and years and years of working and basically being loyal, even though I had other jobs to supplement my income, I had to, obviously. Can't survive on 3 cents a word. But I was showing them that after all of that, you can look forward to a cent increase, or like a half a cent increase, percentage of a cent, is what we kept saying. So it was never about me. It was me looking to my left and to my right and seeing all these incredibly talented people. And I felt like I knew that they deserved better.
Yeah. That's your first job in the industry, and like actually organizing and like demanding more is really bold, and I like commend you for that. Like, I don't mean to be patronizing, but I feel like, you know, that is the people who I think in the games industry are the most vulnerable are people who are new to the industry, who are trying to like build a reputation and trying to like, you know, build the networks to move forward, and being able to take that risk, which is a risk, is so I think you're very brave.
we kept each other brave, I think.
Yeah. Well, can you talk about, like, so a strike doesn't come out of no, well, actually, hold on. I have like so many questions. Sorry.
Ask all the questions.
I'm going to ask a couple of questions together, and you can answer them however you want, or we can come back to them. Sure. I'm curious about, like, how does a strike work without a union? You know, like, how did you even start talking to each other to get to that point? Because a strike does not happen overnight. And then where does CODE come into all of this in terms of the voltage strike?
And don't mind me if you see me typing. I just might write down your questions so that I can keep on track.
Yeah, and I can pop in and share them. I feel like I didn't know where to start, and those are the things that like popped into mind.
Sure. We strike without a union because obviously we're not the only people who work on these games. I've never tried to claim full ownership of anything I work on. It's a huge team. Artists, writers, programmers, producers, management, we all work together. But the fact remains that they are visual novels, and a huge portion of the work is the writing. And even if your union is never officially recognized, if you control the labor, you control a decent amount of the power. You alone don't do much, but, you know, and when we all went on strike, it took about, I want to say a few weeks for them to start running out of content, which says something about the deadlines we were under too. That it was immediate, like that's how fast paced the writing could be, that only a few weeks in they were stretching out what they had left that we turned in. I turned in one of my last scripts like on midnight before the strike started officially, and because I really wanted to finish that. It was like the last episode of a thing, and I'm like, I can't, I have to do it. It's not strike time yet. Let's go.
Yeah, totally. So yeah,
how
like
it came in.
Yeah, please. Sorry. I was just gonna say, like, prompt you, just like how did that start, like, to even get to that point?
We were talking amongst ourselves for a while, and we finally were like, hey, can we start a union? And basically everyone else was like, I don't know, can we? So we started doing research, and we found out, we started Googling stuff, and through that we found CODE, and through CODE we found Emma and our other organizer, Wes. Oh God, what's Wes's last name?
McEnany.
McEnany, sorry. And they helped us out with basically every step of the way.
So Emma, what does that mean? What was CODE's involvement in getting them to the point of a strike?
For sure. And actually, before I touch on that, I want to pick out something Christy said there. Like, she kind of skipped past it a little bit, but I want to underline what she was talking about, which is that, like, ultimately they have a union. Those workers are a union. And that's not even just a semantical argument that, you know, workers are fighting together. Like, the reality of it is they mapped out the workplace, got everyone together, formed a supermajority, actually formed a 100% majority participation strike, which is rare. And they understood that it doesn't matter if you're legally recognized by the government to be a union. It doesn't matter if you're recognized by your boss to be a union. The reality is they had economic power and leverage because they are the ones who create arguably the most essential portion of their game. And if they stop working, the entire studio shuts down, which is what happened. Which is funny because the boss claims they're not essential workers and that they can be independent contractors because they're not essential to the business operations. And yet when they stopped working, the entire studio stopped functioning.
Interesting.
Obviously that's not accurate. But my point is, we the workers get to define what a union is, because the union is Chrissy and her coworkers. It's me and my fellow coworkers, right? That's what a union is. And literally for like 66% of modern history, unions were a thing and they did not have legal recognition. In fact, most of the time they were illegal. It's only until the 1935 NLRA, which is the National Labor Relations Act, in which it became like a legally government kind of filtered structure, right? So I just want to really underline that, like, Chrissy is in a union. She has built a union with her coworkers.
Yeah, that's really good clarification in terms of, we think of unions as like an organization that you pay dues to and that have like staff operating it. But what you're positing is that like a union is just people who come together to work on doing better in their workplace.
Yeah.
And that takes many, many forms, like Chrissy's.
Yeah, it was sort of funny that a lot of people had a sticking point. It's like, they're not even a real union anyway. Like, that mattered. But collective action is collective action is collective action. It doesn't matter what we call ourselves, even though we are a union. It's just, yeah, it was interesting to go through that.
Yeah. So Emma, what was CODE like? What did CODE do to support them, or what does that relationship look like between the Voltage Union, which we'll just call it that now, and and CODE?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mean, they reached out. They got in touch with Wes first, my co-campaign lead, who comes from like the Fight for 15 and SEIU organizing. He's like a total badass. Which is also wonderful because mostly working with a bunch of women and non-binary folks and queer folks. He's like this big burly white Bostonite with a mustache. It's fantastic. Anyway, and so I think the first thing we really wanted to do was like fully chart out the kind of situation as it stood, right? Exactly how many writers were there, exactly who knew who was involved, who wasn't yet, who do we not even know yet, right? Because there were people like that none of the writers even knew or had talked to. So there were some people who we didn't know who their name was because everything was so fractured. You have to keep in mind, they all work remotely, not just after COVID, but even before COVID, they had never met in person, any of these writers, which is why I don't buy any argument from people who say like you can't do labor organizing during COVID because they just went on 100% participation strike and they've never met each other in person. They were able to build that solidarity and community and connection, right? So, I mean, the book was really charting that out and then really pushing them to get every single person engaged, make connections and relationships with every single person, figure out exactly the issues and things that motivate each person and tie that back to the idea of organizing, tie that back to kind of the collective fate of all the writers, right? And, obviously there's a lot of training and education we do around how to organize, how to have those conversations to bring people into it. How to think strategically and tactically about their workplace, right? Because one of the most tricky things about organizing is it's not just, picking a fight or, making some demands or what have you. It's ultimately got to be about building working class consciousness. And what that's all built on is an understanding that you actually have a lot of power, not individually, but workers have a huge amount of power together because without you, your company does not function. Your shareholders can't extract, profit from you, right? Unless you're doing the work for them. That is what a company is. And so, I think it took some time, but when I felt most confident knowing that they were thinking about going on strike was when it became really clear they fully understood that they had a huge amount of economic power, not just in the abstract, but like in reality, tangible economic power. And that is tangible power that I'm sure the boss felt when they went on strike. So I think that kind of understanding of one's own position and power collectively is, I think, one of the hardest things to build, but they were really great at building it. And I think that comes through kind of pushing the boundaries, seeing what you can and can't get away with, making requests to the boss. When they deny it, escalate, ratchet up one more step. When they fail to like meet you on that concession too, ratchet it up. And the reality is no one ever gets to a strike like out of nowhere. It's something that's built towards. And it's also essentially a nuclear option. Nobody wants to go on strike. I mean, it can be an adrenaline rush and kind of exciting sometimes, but it's terrifying and it's a risk. And, Chrissy and her coworkers essentially put themselves at risk because they had no legal protections in doing it. Most workers do, but they didn't because of the nature of their employment. And so they could have been legally fired immediately. They could have.
A lot of people thought we were.
Yeah, a lot of people thought you would be. Yeah. But they didn't. And the way we got to that is first, making polite asks through, the chain of command, going through the proper structures. When the boss inevitably is like, actually, no, we don't want to pay you a living wage. You just ratchet it up one more thing at a time. And eventually the boss has been uncooperative to the point where there is nothing left. All we have to say is you're dependent on us and we're going to teach you that by not letting you use our labor.
Yeah. I do want to just sort of punctuate my labor organizing experience is very minimal, but I was a part of a strike that was one of the largest strikes of the union in Canada, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter. But it was... Which union, though? It was a SEIU union when I was in grad school. And it was, you don't go into those lightly. And it was like 8 months. It was like, we couldn't do our schooling and get paid and do all the things that we needed to do because the choice was made to demand more. We ultimately lost and were forced back to work. But it is. I just want to reiterate for folks who might not be familiar or haven't gone through it that like it is not an easy choice and it has a lot of consequences. And that's kind of why I was saying earlier, like it was really brave to do this, right? Like there's a lot of risk involved and it's not just like, cool, fun, we're playing activists now, right? Like there's a lot of stakes. Chrissy, can you talk a little bit about like your side as a worker, working with CODE and building up to the strike and what that felt like for you all and the community, like the people in your union?
Sure. Well, we got in contact with Emma and Wes. We started researching it basically. And you're right, it wasn't something we did lightly. We weren't like motivated by anger is something that we always like to stress. We weren't motivated by too much anger or resentment or like, yeah, we're gonna stick it to the man or anything. There was a lot of fear. There was a lot of anxiety. It was less, I've said this before, burning a flag and going on a hill, and a lot of 2 a.m. conversations of us looking at each other and going, are we doing the right thing? Um, but Wes and Emma kept us grounded and helped us realize our own worth, basically. And for a while, we thought that we could come to an easy, reasonable solution with Voltage, because again, these are our friends, these are our coworkers. I respect them, they respect us. You know, it, even if they keep saying, "No, we can't pay you more. No, we can't pay you more. No, you can't pay you more." Um, so I figure,
so striking wasn't the first
no,
the first lob of like
no,
let's be better,
absolutely
right?
not. No.
I assume it started with like negotiations and like demands for better conditions.
Yeah, individually we tried. We kept getting shut down. So that's when we decided we had to go as a group. We talked it out. We talked about what we wanted, what we needed, what we weren't getting. It's easy to find problems. It's hard to find like a solution to them. And we loved what we did. We didn't want to stop. We didn't want to put it at risk. We were new to the industry. We were lucky to have these jobs. We're in a pandemic. Um, but we figured now is perhaps the only time to make our voices heard. Um, so we sent them a message after individual negotiations kept getting shut down repeatedly. Um, you have 48 hours to negotiate with us about these things, and if you don't, we're going on strike. Like, escalate. Like, we need business. And part of going on strike means telling everyone you're on strike. We wanted to tell the fans. So we did get some like shocked reactions like, why did you tell everyone you went on strike? Well, the game's gonna stop coming out soon, and we think that the fans deserve to know why that's happening. Um, we're all extremely conflict avoidant, so it's really funny that we're seen as a revolutionary force. We did our best to keep this like contained. We encouraged fans not to boycott or do things to hurt the game or the company. Nobody strikes for a company they don't want to work at, I think. But Voltage responded publicly with this really tone deaf statement. And that's when this stone started rolling. And I remember something I said before we did this. To Vow, I said I was so nervous about going public on social media about this because I know that fan engagement at this level is not a spigot that you can turn on or off when it gets too overwhelming. It's like if we do this, it's not turning on a spigot, it's redirecting a river. So then we told them, then Voltage responded with a public statement that made everyone think we were fired. And well, that's when this thing exploded and everyone was suddenly talking about it. Like, how could Voltage do this and this and that? Uh, it was crazy.
Yeah.
It was crazy. And that's when all like the articles started coming out too.
Yeah, I'm actually curious from both of you about going on strike in an industry that has like very involved fans, like very direct engagement between the product and the workers in some ways. Like what does that look like in games for organizing? And how did the fans react at Voltage? Or Emma, if you want to speak more broadly to what that means for games and tech organizing in your experience so far.
Sure, yeah, I can cover it broadly, then I'd love to hear Chrissy's kind of version of how it was interacting with the fans. So I mean, to really zoom out, in organizing, it's really important that we don't just, I guess, put blinders on and only see workers as people who exist in the workplace. We're whole people. We're human beings. We have families and friends and churches and communities and all kinds of things. So in organizing, if you're failing to organize in the community in support of whatever organizing is going on in the workplace, you have a really weak organizing campaign. So it's really essential to organize both the workplace and the workers' community itself. In the case of games, like you're saying, we have a huge community in that it's the audience, it's the players, it's the people who actually, enjoy the work that we do. And obviously, I think Chrissy's work is really meaningful to a lot of people because it's, representative and it has a lot of queer storylines that I think is really important to folks. And so that community is really, really essential to organizing, and we knew that would be the case. So it was really important that, yeah, to Chrissy's point, we didn't frame the organizing as like waving a flag and storming the barricades, and more like we're here because we care about the work we do. We want to protect that. We want to make sure people have good conditions so that way we can continue to do the really good work that we're proud of and we hope that you enjoy, right?
Yeah.
That's like a professional stance, and that's like sticking your neck out for professionalism, right? So I think it's really important people understand that, and it was so important in terms of how they related with the player community, to ensure that they had the support and momentum that the boss couldn't just totally shape their own narrative, like, well, the players hate you and you're destroying the game, and it's like, actually no, the players on every single social media post you have like 100 comments where they're all like, please just pay your writers money. That would be really great if they could afford rent and food. Please do that. And like so many comments, wonderful, sweet comments of people being like, we don't care if it's delayed for like a year. Just treat your workers right. Like, we support the workers. Like, it was almost unanimous support. I was really blown away by it, and I know everyone else was too. And I think it actually speaks to something really worth noting, which is I think a lot of the people I've worked with in terms of organizing in games have assumed that players will be a massive impediment to organizing. And I actually don't think that's true. Obviously, there is a relatively large portion of the general games player base that can be really toxic. It can harass players as well as game developers themselves. But I think the vast bulk of people really aren't that way. I think people who play games and are social, online playing games together, they're social people. They like to build community by default. Like, there's a reason why we have community managers in the games industry. It's like a huge part of what we do. And I think the right example of like when the writers went on walkout over forced arbitration, the players were really supportive, and the workers made an effort to get in touch with the players, and it was really, really impactful. And I think we saw huge results from that as well. When I think a lot of people would assume, oh, don't touch the Riot fan base. They're not gonna have a good time with this one. But actually, just literally thousands of messages came out of support, and the exact same thing I think happened here, even more so. So I just want to really note it's really essential, that notion of organizing community, and in games in particular, it takes a unique form that, it's not like your local community groups and like soccer clubs and churches. It's like this larger amorphous online international community, and that can be really kind of wild and scary, but also powerful if you do the work of connecting with them.
Yeah. Chrissy, how did it feel for you and the other organizers to get that kind of reaction from your audience?
Overwhelming and humbling. I think public opinion of game workers' rights has shifted in recent years. Maybe that's just my perception of it after this. But we were blown away by the support because part of our union strategy, like the core of it, is that we're supporting each other. And we were prepared to like support each other financially too, because some of us had like 9 to 5s while working with Voltage. And so we shot out the idea of like passing the hat around once the strike started. And like a week had passed without wages for some of us. who had no other job. So we saw the fan reaction and we said, "Hey, can you help us out a little?" And we started a GoFundMe for a week's, like a week's worth of wages, maybe. I
That was
think
the
it was. That was the first one, and they blew through that goal in like 24 hours. That was insane.
Wow. That's
That was so
really,
much passion.
yeah, that must feel really, like, must have felt really supported by this community, like, really caring about what you were doing. Is that, I'm sorry. I was just wondering, like, is that a thing that you've seen happen, Emma, in terms of, like, the audience actually, like, helping to support the employees
Totally.
during these moments?
Yeah, totally. And I think that's something we're only going to see more and more of, as more workplaces and more groups of coworkers support each other and, engage in organizing, whether it's the news catching stuff of going on strike or the more normal stuff, which is just building relationships and building community and networks of trust amongst the coworkers.
Yeah.
I think we're just going to see more and more of these really wonderful, positive things. And I think it'll have a good, positive ripple out effect in the broader games community too, when people start to see such like optimistic, professional community, which I think has been lacking a lot in the games industry, personally.
Yeah. So, what happened? How did the strike end? What did you get? What does that all look like, Chrissy?
Just sort of like building off something Emma said about things changing. I also think that we're starting to see a lot more outcry against things like crunch culture. Because the players understand now that we're not mindless worker drones, and they care about the people who make the games that they enjoy. And most people don't want to think that they enjoy this game at the cost of someone not being able to pay rent, or we're social animals. We don't want to hurt each other. But the end of the strike, it was eventually we negotiated higher pay for everybody at about like an average of a 60% increase.
78%.
Hey, that's way better. So yeah, some of us got oh god, I'm so sorry. I suddenly got so nervous and blanked out.
You're okay. You're okay.
We got deadlines extensions and more open communications in some cases. It hasn't been super easy getting back to it all. There's some hurt feelings all around, I think, and a lot of perception that we did this because we hate voltage. Producers were nervous to talk to us again. I feel like they were nervous that we would come in and start barking at them and trying to throw our weight around. There's been some roadblocks. I'm not going to pretend that everything's super hunky-dory right now, because it's not. The progress is still moving, and just because things aren't as bad as they could be doesn't mean they can't be better.
Yeah, so I think that leads me to ask, like, what comes after a strike then? Like, I imagine that that's not the end.
No, never. Just like how even if you have no union and you organize to having a recognized union and a contract, that is never the end. That is start one. That's when you have a foundation you can start really organizing. Because even when you make concessions and you win certain improvements like Chrissy and her coworkers did, you have to defend those things, because turns out companies make decisions not based off of moral choices, but instead their bottom line. And it's not like I'm not saying everyone's like evil, greedy penny pinchers, but the reality is a company functions based off of their return on investment and squeezing as much profit out of the work as possible, right? That ends up manifesting in trying to chip away at workers' conditions to save money, right? So that means even if you win your concessions, you then have to defend it. Even if you planted your flag, you have to build a nice fence and guard towers around it, right? And so that's the kind of the work I think Christy's kind of talking about, in that they have to stay vigilant. They don't get to they did I think get a rest for a few days, but then it's back at it. We got to make sure that we're strong. No one is giving in. The boss is going to be trying to pressure us individually and find ways to divide us. They're going to try to hire new people and replace us. How do we address all of those things that could undermine the improvements that we've won here, right? Yeah. So it continues always. Organizing is never a static final thing. It's not a box you can check off. It's a process, and it's about building democratic worker agency in the workplace, and that is something that has to be maintained. It can't just exist perfectly in isolation.
Especially for your more vulnerable coworkers.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk more about that, Chrissy?
I guess it's just sort of like if that just spelled out. It's true though, but there are people there who I've been working there the longest, so I'm like the most senior writer, and I felt protected even during the strike. If that sounds weird at all, I'm sorry. Um, like I felt like I could get other work, and I was just like, I need to stick true to this because other people are relying on me. Um, and at the same time, I also had the most to lose by joining this. I was very comfortable where I was, honestly. I was like, sure, 4 cents a word. I'm fine with that. I have other jobs. But it was basically like, I have to join this. It has to be 100% of us. 100% of the writing team became a meme for us, actually. We put it in an image and we had it like shake, like 100% of the writing team. It had to be us. It had to be all of us together, or else this wouldn't work. So for the people around me, I had to try to step up, I guess. I don't think of myself as a leader. We're all leaders here, is what we kept saying also. But also, I just wanted to show them that I was there to support them any way they needed.
Yeah, absolutely. All
Can I
right.
build a little bit on what Chris was saying?
Of course.
Sorry.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah,
Something
yeah.
I really think is really worth noting too, and kind of pulling out of this, is that definitely their strength comes from their numbers and the economic leverage they have collectively as workers. But I want to note, like, one of the most essential things about their organizing, also both prior to, during, and after the strike, has been their communication with each other. They do not paint over issues. If there's some kind of thing that has someone really anxious and stressed, or some obstacle the boss has tried to throw at them or whatever, we immediately try to get them all together to talk about it, work through it, hash it out, never like paint things over. And I think it's really important to note that I think one of the most fundamental things to good organizing is communication, like real, honest, vulnerable communication. And for me, I think the moment I started feeling confident about their chances during the strike wasn't when the players came out in support, and it wasn't when the industry came out in support, and the boss was making just terrible moves in terms of kind of making themselves look like jerks when they really didn't need to. The thing that really convinced me that they were going to do it was when like I started getting phone calls at like 1 a.m. from like one of the writers, and they'd be like, "Hey, I'm really stressed. I'm having a panic attack, and I really need to talk to you." And like we would talk through it and like work through things and kind of ground them again. And I think the fact that they felt comfortable and trusting enough to be vulnerable like that, and to air those fears and anxieties with each other, build it builds such a strength, like such a iron strength between people when you can be that way with each other, really emotionally and personally vulnerable. And I think that's the thing that actually enables a powerful strike like this. It's that trust and communication. So I want to note that, because it's kind of fluffy, it's a little emotional stuff, but
it's
I think
important.
It's actually really essential to it.
Yeah. So what is what does it look like for Code to, are you continuing to be involved with this with the workers at Voltage? Like, what is that relationship looking like for the two of you?
Yeah. I mean, we continue to meet regularly and talk about the things that are coming up, and helping people think through stuff. We're also thinking, man, I can't talk about things.
Yeah, please don't
like ways to pivot the organizing, because I think their strike and the attention they had has presented some opportunities for them, and so we're also trying to brainstorm like new things to take on, not just defending the wins that they had, and improving just Voltage. So there's a lot to be done. I think there's like infinite amounts of work to be done in organizing, not just in writing, but in the whole games industry. So that's where a lot of the attention is now. I think, yeah, maybe Christy can speak to that more, but that's where we're at, continuing to work with them and try to help them as much as they think is helpful.
Great.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, did you want to add to that, Chrissy?
Just that we're working on things.
Great. No,
Keep an eye on us.
not trying to prod, not trying to get an exclusive here. We're good. So I want to pivot just a little bit to like larger issues around union organizing, sort of pulling back from Voltage a bit. We have seen over the last several years shifts happening, largely like social shifts and cultural shifts that are happening both in and out of games. And so thinking about the attention that is now being paid to online harassment or toxicity in gaming communities, or things like Me Too being very prominent in games over the last couple of years, where more and more folks are coming forward about abuse in the games industry. Do you feel like labor organizing is related to these issues?
It's not just related, I think it's essential. Because I think if social movements like you're talking about, ones that are anti-patriarchal and trying to build voice and agency for women and marginalized gendered folks, and if that is what one's goal is, and I think it's a great goal, you're going to need leverage. You're going to need teeth on that movement. And, social pressure, PR, communications, advocacy, education, all those things are essential. They lay the groundwork for making that change. But I think the thing that actually forces change and creates new conditions is having the teeth of like real organizing. And I think one really important aspect of that would be labor organizing. And frankly, I would say I think people talk a lot about the wage gap in the games industry, whether it's between white folks and people of color, or straight folks and LGBTQ folks, or disabled folks and able folks, or white, men and non-men, whatever the case may be. Just shining a light on the problem, turns out it does not fix it, because it turns out people still want to get away with paying people.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
But you know what? The thing that actually does fix it, systemically changing the balance of power in favor of the people who are actually impacted by this. And another example would be if you had a union contract where your collective pay was decided by, I work in X job title, I have such and such seniority, I've been here at the company for this amount of time, this is the pay I get. That's like the decided pay I get, right? There's like a table of pay. If that's the contract you have collectively at your workplace, it prevents, literally, it like deroots the notion of wage discrimination. Because if they have those numerical things lined up, there's no wiggle room for the boss to underpay someone or dock their pay in some fashion, right? And to worm them out of the way where they get to intimidate a new young worker, in a one-on-one interview, and make them feel not confident in asking for money, when we know men on average and white folks on average are more confident asking for those kinds of pay raises and stuff in interviews. It's just statistically the case. And so removing that kind of stress and conflict and like weird individual personalized discrimination is really essential. And I think it's a huge part of organizing. And I think just the wage discrimination thing is only one tiny aspect of that. You can apply that to hiring and diversity initiatives and retention, and ensuring progression for people who aren't white guys in the industry. I think you can apply it to pretty much anything. And we spend a third of our lives at work. Gee, wouldn't it be great if we had some power and representation and a voice there, so that way we can make sure a third of our lives is more equitable and fair to everyone who's involved, right? So that's my take, at least, on how it relates.
Yeah, nice. How about we go to some questions? Because we've got one.
Quick, though,
oh,
what
please.
Emma said, just linking it together with that. I don't know if Voltage. A lot of the stories that we write are queer or otherwise marginalized, and Voltage always does their best to hire a writer to make it own voices, if you've heard that term. But because they were severely underpaying us, I don't know if this wasn't their intent, but what happened was they were exclusively underpaying their marginalized writers while profiting off of the authenticity of their voice.
Yeah.
So that was the end result there. So that also motivated us to be like, hey, we're writing these stories for a reason, because they're stories only we can tell, and we're so honored and thrilled to be able to tell them. But again, gee, wouldn't it be nice to be paid at least bare minimum, which is 6 cents a word, by the way, for those writers listening. But yeah, go on. That was it. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, no, please. Great. Thank you for adding that. Okay, so we have a couple of questions. This one is for Emma. It's from Arlene. It says, I'm a union machinist but a good number of the union folks I work with don't like the union. I think this has to do with the history of the past 40 years of unions being bashed. Is that kind of dislike or resistance to unions an issue you have to deal with among workers in the game development space?
That's an awesome question, and I would actually really love to talk to you about your experience. I mean, the truth is, it doesn't matter what industry you organize in, whether it's coal mining or coffee shop barista work or game industry work. It's going to be the same things, because the culture in the United States and really in a lot of the Western world is so infused with anti-union sentiment and the idea that workers don't deserve to have a say over their lives. Not really. Go to the ballot box every 2 or 4 years, you get to have your say. But like beyond that, the thing you do every single day, every single week of your life, no, you don't get to have a say over that. That's a top-down, like freaking, not what am I trying to say? Autocracy, right? And I think there's a lot in the media and the culture that really reinforces that. There's also a lot in terms of legislation and in terms of like stripping away the rights and ability of unions to organize over the last few decades. And we were at our peak in the 30s and 40s where we had a third of the U.S. population, the working population, in unions. A third, 1 out of every 3 workers was in a union. Imagine that. And these were like live fighting, scrappy unions at the time, right? And there's been a chipping away and undermining of that over long term. In the 50s, obviously, Red Scare and purging gave lots of cover and excuses for destroying the union and labor movement. But I think there's also fault within the labor movement as well as to why people don't fully understand or trust unions, or the myths aren't able to be busted through as easily. I think after the 50s, the movement in at least large portions of it, moved away from class struggle, like genuine class struggle. They turned towards, let's just defend our contracts, whatever territory we have, let's just defend that. Let's not do new organizing. Oh, there's new industries, let's not organize them. Well, let's just stick in our little bubble, right? And it kind of, I think it's over time isolated itself, and it's become stagnant, because I think when you're organizing, if you're not growing, you're dying. That's just the case. If you're not including all the new people coming to the workforce, like tech workers and game workers and so on, you're dying. And I think it's an existential problem for the labor movement that we have to cover to bring in tech and game workers and digital workers. And so my point really is, we've turned away from class struggle organizing, more into kind of just legalistic recognition organizing. And that's important. That's a good part of it too. But we have to do, I think, the education work, the community building work, the genuine deep organizing that it takes to really not just make demands, but have the power necessary to like force them to happen, right? And I think there's always been portions of the labor movement that continue to do it. The labor movement is in a huge upswing of revitalization. We've seen strike waves amongst teachers and graduate student walkouts and massive wildcat strikes. People are rediscovering class struggle. They're rediscovering that it's not just good enough to talk about the things we want to fix. We have to find the literal economic and political power to force those changes we want to see, right? But I think the more we can embrace that, the more and more people come to understand what unions really are, that it's workers in motion, that it's you and your coworkers fighting for each other and for the future of your work. The more and more we can do those good examples of organizing, the more and more that bubble will burst, and people will understand that also, if you feel like your union doesn't represent you, if you feel like it's stagnant and not doing that good community building work and that fighting work, make it do that. Because the union is you and your coworkers, you and the other members of your union. It's your job to get engaged and be educated and participate, because a democratic institution does not function if its members are not engaged and educated and informed and driving it. You have to build that agency. And so I would encourage people to like start that revitalization work if that's where you feel like your union is at. Yeah. That being said, and I will stop talking. I know I can't.
That's okay.
The last thing I'll say is, even a stagnant bad union is better than no union. I will just say that. Like, it's just such a difference to have, like, for instance, just cause protections versus at will employment, or even the barest boned, weakest union contract is better than not working union. I can just guarantee it to like everybody.
I do want to just like expand a little bit, it just in terms of like any kind of social justice progress that you're fighting towards, you have to keep fighting for it. Like you're talking about this, like if you don't organize, you die. The same thing around any kind of social justice movement, whether it's labor organizing or in terms of race, class, or well, class is labor organizing, gender, like all of the issues that I think are very paramount and very important to our everyday lives. Like progress doesn't happen by itself. We're not just on some progress. It doesn't just continue and go. And I think that we feel like progress happens depending on who's the president and depending on which party's in power. And we kind of stop working towards making our society better around our really fractured political system. And so this is my own soapbox of being like, yo, we have to keep fighting constantly. Like that's why this is kind of exhausting, and also taking care of yourself and your mental health in the process of doing that, right? Because we need folks here in the long haul. We are like close to time, but there is a question for Chrissy, and I want to make sure that we get to that. Yeah. Redact Cat asks, for writers or workers in general looking to hop into the industry for the first time, what do you think are some questions they should consider asking their employer? And then there's a follow-up of not just questions, but also things to look out for.
Ooh, okay. That was a lot of things.
Yeah, just, like what should people who are new to the industry look for in their future workplaces?
It's most important, I think, to not let yourself be fractured if you're joining some place new. It sounds silly, I guess, but you want to make friends with the people around you, and you want to see what's their deal. You want to also not only think about what can I get out of this, but what are the conditions for everybody else. And if you see some general dissatisfaction, maybe don't let that scare you away, but maybe use that as an opportunity to form stronger bonds with each other. Big red flags would be irrational payment. And I know it's really, really hard as a writer to know what you're worth, but I promise you there's resources out there that'll tell you what you should be charged for your work. And you yourself, don't be afraid to be cocky. You know what you're worth. You know that you're not worth 1 cent a word. You know that. And so you have to try and take that attitude with you when you're applying places. And things to ask.
I think that was a great response.
Yeah, right?
Emma, do you want to chime in at all?
I think actually the questions about, I think it's worth asking the employer about, the community in the workplace and how people relate and, how people support each other. Because I think that'll give you a better clue almost than anything else into what it's actually like to work there. And also if they're totally horseshitting you, right? Yeah. It's really easy to see through a boss who's like, yeah, everything's super great. We never have problems. It's like, we're like such a family. Like, no, that's a red flag. Turn
that's
the hell
a red
around
flag.
And sprint out of the room. But I think ask about the community, the support, the relationships between coworkers in the workplace, because that will indicate that I think so much more about what it'll be like to actually be there than almost anything else. And it can also indicate like probably a good place to where you could organize because people care about each other and they're already talking and they have community. You can build on that.
Nice.
I don't want to say don't believe anything your boss tells you. I don't want to say don't believe anything your boss tells you, but maybe don't believe everything your boss tells you.
Absolutely. Okay, so last question. I think this is a really nice wrap up for us to end the segment. We've gotten several questions about what can people do. So, there's ones around, was asked like, what can fans of the writers and artists and games do to support them after the strike has ended? We got another question of how can this person, as someone who's in a very well-off position at a stable tech company, support unions for games and other tech companies?
That's awesome. Chrissy, do you want to tackle the first one about how players can support?
Keep playing Voltage. I think Vivian's coming out in a few days. That's my story. She's great. You should read it and buy it. Yes, promotional material. But on a more genuine note, just keeping in contact with the people, with the workers themselves, if they have a public face, which we do at the Vow Twitter and Tumblr, we try to keep it a little low key and professional there, but we can be reached through there. Just reaching out around you. Again, I keep saying reaching out around you because that's what I did. So that's my only experience with organizing is I look to my left and to my right, just not at my superiors, but at the people who I was working with who were on the same level as me, you know? So, Emma, please help.
No, that's great. And I think to the question about how can a tech worker or a game worker help with organizing or support organizing, I think my blunt answer is you literally cannot, and your support means nothing unless you are also organizing. That's just the case. And even if you feel like you have a comfortable situation, you feel like you have good conditions, why the hell would I organize? It doesn't make any sense. Here's an answer. So that way you can actually move your good conditions and your leverage, your power as a comfortable tech worker in the favor of people who don't have those conditions. You should be able to organize amongst your coworkers so that you can fight and organize in solidarity with other people. Simple stated support, frankly, doesn't mean a whole lot in and on its own. So I would encourage you to organize and reach out to us to talk to you about how to organize, because a lot of people we organize with are really comfortable tech workers who don't think they need to organize. Turns out 30 seconds into an organizing conversation, there's like 20 reasons immediately that you can find from them exactly what motivates them, what pisses them off, what things they wish were changed, what things they're worried about the boss chipping away at, right? A lot of the companies where we do have good conditions as tech workers, the companies are really trying to figure out how to gut that, how to undermine that in the long term. Part of that is like hiring massive quantities of temp workers and agency workers and contract workers that will slowly undermine the conditions and labor in the entire company, and also just flooding the market with trained people, so that way the value of the labor goes down. These are all things we could talk about too. It's a little bit more abstracted to the political economic realm, but there's like a lot of reasons to organize, and not just bread and butter stuff. If you have great conditions, perfect. You've gone past where everyone else in the labor movement has to fight to. Now that you have good conditions, fight even further for the things that are driven by your values, your ethics, the things you want to see, for control over your work and making sure that your boss isn't using it for terrible reasons. Go further than where most of the people in the labor movement get to go, because they have so far to go just to get to normal conditions. You have a great starting point. Fight even further is what I would say. So if you want to support organizing, reach out to us. We'll help you. We'll talk to you about how to work with your coworkers and build something really powerful.
Well, perfect. How do people find out about you and reach out to you?
One thing, one solid thing, the thing that radicalized me, one solid thing you could do, share your wages.
Yeah.
This is step number one. Don't be afraid of that.
Yeah, and I believe we saw that happen earlier this year. A bunch of games folks just started posting their wages, and it was a very interesting it's very interesting to see the wage disparities that happen in games, because we think of it as a pretty affluent space, and it is for some people.
For some people.
Yeah.
And it's funny, I had friends who filled out that survey and thought, I have really good conditions, I have great pay. And then they look at the person next to them and are like, holy shit, I did not know you were making that much money. And you have the same title and experience as me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that is really important. That's a great example.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you for sharing that, Chrissy. All right. So if people do want to get a hold of you, Emma, or Code, and learn more about that, where might one do that?
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I think the number one thing is check out our website, CODE-CWA.org. You can reach out to us through there to talk about organizing, or you can attend our organizer trainings, which you can find on there as well. Completely free. We run them on every single weekend. So if you want to learn more about it, like the actual skills it takes to do it, and the skills that Chrissy and her coworkers learned to do the work they did, go to the website, code-cwa.org. We're on Twitter, code_CWA. And if you want to reach out to me, I'm on Twitter at Emma Kinema, and my DMs are open if people have questions or want to talk about organizing.
Great. And Chrissy, how do we learn more about you and what you do, and Vow?
Vow has a Twitter, Vow_together.
Great.
And we also have a Tumblr. That's it.
Awesome. Yeah. And those are all linked in the chat and will be in the show notes. Thank you, both of you, for coming on and being so honest and upfront about all of this. I think that it helps to dispel some of the mythology around organizing and strikes and what that means and really humanizing it. So I appreciate your time.
Yeah, no, and thanks for having us on.
Yeah,
really appreciate
cool.
it.
Thanks.
Yeah, this was awesome.
Awesome. Thanks, all of you, for joining us. As usual, I appreciate all of your attendance and hanging out with us. I want to thank our mods for keeping this space friendly. And if you want to watch this video or any of our future videos or past videos, I guess you can't watch future videos. You can only watch past videos. But
that would be really great.
Yeah, you like that? It's cool. It's cool.
Feature.
Yeah, you can do that at youtube.com/gameshotline. The Games Hotline is a free resource for everyone, and that means that we want to keep it that way so that folks can use it, and it will be there for you when you need it. If you want to help us do that, please consider donating. You can just chip in a couple of bucks, and it makes all the difference in the world. You can do that at gameshotline.org/donate. If last sentence, I'm gonna get it out. It's gonna happen. Join us next week when we have guest host Carolyn Pettit on, when she's gonna be talking to Joe Triato from Latinx in Games. All right, everyone. I'm gonna go not talk for a couple hours. Bye.
Bye.